Resident Evil Zero is an ambitious game, one that tries new things and shoots for the stars. That's a respected effort in a series that, up to this point, has had nothing but great successes. But all of its attempts to change the formula, to reinvent the wheel, result in failure. The game attempts to change the foundation of the series by introducing new mechanics, changing old ones, and shifting the dynamic of what a Resident Evil game is. These additions and changes don't really breed new results, though. They only serve to break down what already worked and effectively make it worse. Its removal of the item box system from previous games results in nothing but frustration, as trying to manage your inventory while items are spread across a massive environment becomes more infuriating as the game goes on. The character switching system can be fun and ingenious at certain points. While its technology is certainly impressive, it expands upon the issues that Code Veronica had, making those even more apparent and worse. The game at least has the fact that it is still a pretty gorgeous survival horror game on its side, though. While its story isn't the most intriguing, it gets the job done. Its environments are grotesque, broken down, ruined, and slimy, but the game overall feels like kind of an affront to the entries that came before it. I love the simplicity in the first few Resident Evil games. The design of those games gives the player uncomplicated mechanics, and the player's choices make those mechanics have depth. The systems in the first few games in the series are not incredibly varied. It's what was done with those simple systems that makes them impressive. These games have clean design, like a tidy room that has just been organized. The sheets are fresh, and everything is in its proper place. In contrast, Resident Evil Zero feels messy. McDonald's cups strewn across the floor, fast food bags crumpled up in the corner, roaches crawling on the ceiling. It feels like chaos when you compare this game to the first few entries in the series. And at the end of the day, this game just has a ton of problems. Some of them lie in the balance of the enemies, some of them lie in the story, and some of them come from the new mechanics that are introduced. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll be diving deep into Resident Evil Zero and talking about gameplay, story, mechanics, and everything in between. If you haven't watched my previous videos on the Resident Evil series, you can check them out in this playlist at the top of your screen. If you enjoy the video, consider giving it a like, as it really helps the video's performance. Plus, it's free. If you do enjoy throwing away your hard-earned cash, subscribe to my Patreon, where I'm currently watching the Resident Evil movies and exclusively covering them over there. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Resident Evil Zero. Before we continue with the video, I have a public service announcement to make, because I know this channel is all about the dads, but with Mother's Day coming up, it's time to talk about Mom. Mother's Day is quickly arriving, and you need to get your mom something nice. Not just a gift, but a moment to relax, to unwind, to listen to her favorite podcast. And that comes in the form of premium audio from Raycon. With Raycon's newest model, which is better than ever by the way, you'll get a 32-hour battery life and multi-point connectivity, which allows you to pair two devices at once. And speaking of battery, with Raycon's quick charge function, you'll get 90 minutes of battery life in just 10 minutes of charging. No more waiting for premium audio, all because you forgot to put these things on the charger before you went to bed. And top it all off with Raycon's active noise cancellation, a feature that's pretty difficult to find at such an accessible price point, and you have a deal you just can't pass up. Personally, I love these earbuds, and I especially love the noise cancellation. I wear them every day, even when I'm just trying to take a moment to get away from the computer, just reading a book on the couch. I get to zone out in my little world, and that's all thanks to Raycon. And the protective case covers allow you to personalize your earbuds, picking from multiple unique designs that complement your personal style. So get your mom the gift of premium audio this Mother's Day by going to buyraycon.com/yourfavoriteson for 20% off site-wide. Brought to you by Raycon. Now back to the video. To talk about the development of Resident Evil 0, we need to go back before Code Veronica was even released. During the summer of 1998, the idea came up to create a Resident Evil game where players could swap back and forth between two characters at will. The PlayStation didn't have the capabilities to support these mechanics, so Capcom had to look towards the N64. This is where the game was originally planned and developed. Koji Oda was set to be the director of this entry. Flagship and a few others at Capcom returned to create the scenario for the game. The beginning of Resident Evil was meant to be set on a train, which only took up about a sixth of the game. But this version of the game didn't last long, because the team soon encountered a ton of problems with the N64's capabilities. Since they couldn't fit everything they needed to on one cartridge, they were looking for a more powerful system. Once the GameCube was announced by Nintendo, development had to shift entirely to that platform. Most of the scenario, story, and characters were kept, but everything else had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The Nintendo 64 version of the game was revealed at an early Tokyo Game Show, but for a while fans were wondering what even happened to this project, and it was mostly radio silence on Capcom's end. They revealed the logo at a press event, but that was it for a long time, until the shift in platforms was finally announced. After years of development and a shift in direction, Resident Evil 0 was released for the Nintendo GameCube on November 12, 2002 in North America, November 21, 2002 in Japan, February 28, 2003 in Australia, and March 7, 2003 in the EU. Most of the footage in this video will be from the original GameCube version of this game. While this was the first edition of Resident Evil 0, Capcom also released a Wii version in 2008 and an HD edition in 2016. While the HD remaster is good, I preferred something about the feel of the GameCube version. For the record though, I think both games are pretty similar, and you would probably be justified in choosing either of these to experience this game. Resident Evil 0 actually takes place right before Resident Evil 1. The game opens with a text crawl that sort of recaps the different places that each game has been set in: Raccoon City, Rockford Island, Sheena Island. While there's no official word, we know, and the game itself knows, that Umbrella has been involved in all of these incidents. The crawl asks the question of Umbrella's origins. Where did it come from, and how did it develop the T-virus? The game will sort of touch upon the answers to those questions. It will attempt to set an origin before Resident Evil. And as we see a train full of passengers, we realize this game takes place the day before Resident Evil 1. As the train pushes through the darkness, we see a man standing on a cliff, and suddenly the vehicle is assaulted by leeches, seemingly controlled by this paranormal figure on the rock. 2 hours later, we hear a voiceover from Rebecca Chambers. In the first Resident Evil game, we control the members of Alpha Team as they infiltrate the Arclay mansion. They are there to rescue Bravo Team, who already arrived on scene to investigate a series of mysterious murders in the area. Now we're seeing Bravo Team in the helicopter heading to what will be most of their deaths. The helicopter is suddenly hit and it crashes toward the earth. The soldiers get out and find an overturned truck spilling with dead bodies. They quickly find out that the car was transporting a prisoner named Billy Cohen, a Marine who was guilty of killing 23 people. He was sentenced to death and was being taken to his execution. The Bravo team members pretty quickly arrive at the conclusion that Billy was the one that killed them and resulted in this murder scene that we see here. Bravo team is ready to apprehend the prisoner immediately and begin searching for Cohen.
For execution?
Those poor soldiers. They were good men just doing their jobs, and that scum murdered them and escaped.
All right, everyone, let's separate and survey the area. Our friend is brutal and ruthless. Keep your guard up.
Rebecca stumbles upon a train in the woods, standing still on the tracks. And as she enters, we get a message at the bottom of the screen, very similar to the one that we get at the beginning of Resident Evil 1. Rebecca finds a radio nearby and is eventually overwhelmed by the undead.
But as of 2 years ago, when a similar plan was set up, the local government stepped in and took over.
We're given control of Rebecca for the first time and tasked with taking these foes out. Rebecca moves through the train, investigating its rooms, and eventually finds a strange diary from one of the passengers. This passenger was working for someone who wanted them to investigate an Arklay Mountains laboratory. The production of a specific BOW even had to be stopped because of this investigation. The note also details the experiments they were doing by combining the T-virus with different species. Another note in the next room over details more of that same investigation. These soldiers were attempting to investigate a training facility that was shut down to see if it would be fit to reopen. Down the hall, Rebecca finds a dead train passenger, and Billy appears behind her, pointing a gun at her head. Billy decides to leave after he sees that Rebecca is with the STARS unit, because they're on the search for him. Rebecca tries to stop and arrest him, but she doesn't try that hard because he just walks away.
You're with those soldiers outside.
Oh, I see. You're with STARS. Well, no offense, honey, but your kind doesn't seem to want me around, so I'm afraid our little chat time is over.
Wait! You're under arrest.
No thanks, Dollface. I've already worn handcuffs.
She sees Edward nearby, the pilot of Bravo Team's chopper. He's clearly been bit and infected. He tells Rebecca that the whole forest is full of zombies. He then keels over dead and some Cerberus dogs jump through the window to attack. Rebecca heads back through the train with the dining car key in hand and gets a radio call from Enrico. Enrico is the other member of Bravo Team that was found still alive in Resident Evil 1 when Chris or Jill stumbled upon him in the underground tunnels. He tells Rebecca that Billy killed 23 people and she needs to keep an eye out for him because he's clearly very dangerous. In the next room, she comes face to face with him again. Billy asks Rebecca to team up. They need each other's help, but she declines this invitation. He sends Rebecca upstairs on her own, and a man sits at a nearby dining table. But this clearly is a man no longer, as he transforms into a pile of leeches that eventually form a new type of monster. We load this thing full of bullets, but Rebecca is about to be overcome by leeches before Billy arrives and saves the medic. The leeches crawl away, and we see the strange man outside in the lightning. Before these two can even wonder who that is, the train makes some sort of noise. Rebecca is convinced that she needs the extra manpower and finally agrees to team up with Billy. We're now in control of two characters, Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen. This is where the new elements that Resident Evil 0 introduces are fully formed and put into play. Because of that, it's probably a good time to talk about gameplay. Resident Evil returns to the survival horror roots of its predecessors. That means that it has fixed camera angles. The camera changes as you walk down hallways or enter different corners of a room. This is in contrast to how the last big game in the series, Code Veronica, handled things. Code Veronica introduced a dynamic camera that would sometimes be fixed, but would oftentimes follow the player around an environment by swooping around or changing its position. Code Veronica also introduced full 3D environments to the series to allow for that aforementioned camera change. Resident Evil 0, on the other hand, returns to the pre-rendered backgrounds of old. In fact, Resident Evil 0 was built off of a lot of the framework that the Resident Evil 1 remake was. You can see this in its general design and color palette. The games look so similar, which I guess makes them feel like they fit together as a pair. If you had played Resident Evil 1's remake, then you wouldn't feel like you're moving too much backwards or forwards by playing Resident Evil 0, at least when it comes to aesthetics. But because this is a survival horror game, we use classic survival horror controls to take part in combat with enemies. We hold down the aim button and fire at enemies with our chosen weapon. Ammo is of course restricted, and so are healing items. This is where the horror and the intensity in the game is generated from, the restriction of resources. Getting into encounters with low ammunition is still just as terrifying as it has ever been. Getting into encounters with low healing items is just as intense as before. We can combine different herbs to create healing items, and our general goal in the game is to unlock areas of our environment. This is done by solving various puzzles and getting keys that will allow us to progress. These are all of the things that have stayed the same, but a lot about Resident Evil 0 has changed. The first big introduction to this entry is being able to play two characters at once. In Resident Evil 1 and 2, we could choose from two different characters. Playing through with these characters would slightly change how the game plays and how its design unfolds. But to play through with both characters would require two separate playthroughs. In Resident Evil 0, we control both Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen. Each characters have things that they can do and things that they can't do. Rebecca starts out with the mixing set extra item that allows her to combine herbs. This was a feature that any character could do in previous games, but now it's relegated to only Rebecca. Billy starts out with the lighter item, which is basically only used for one or two puzzles in the game that are required to progress. Rebecca has a bit lower defense than Billy, meaning that if she takes hits, she takes much more damage than he does. Rebecca inflicts less damage on enemies than Billy, and Billy can push large objects, which is required for some of the puzzles in the game. But the real technological jump that this game introduces is the ability to swap between these characters at will. At any time during the game, as long as characters aren't indisposed by the main story, with the press of a button, we can switch to the opposite character. Characters have their own separate inventories, they have their own health statuses, and they even have their own distinct place in solving specific puzzles. Now, the implementation of this system is actually pretty well done in certain places. Honestly, the fact that you can have a character in a room on a different floor of the environment and just swap to them seamlessly is pretty crazy for the time, and it's often pretty cool how this is implemented with puzzles. Certain puzzles will require us to get a handle to fix a lift and send one character upstairs, effectively separating the two for a period of time. Some puzzles will have the character working together with the other, like a box puzzle later in the game where Rebecca has to control a water device up top while Billy pushes boxes around on the bottom. Swapping back and forth between these two characters feels good, and it's generally well done. We can control whether the character we aren't playing, referred to by the game as the partner character, will follow us or stay behind. This is used to control characters with more precision, especially in puzzles when we need that kind of control. If we decide to leave a character behind, that character can still be attacked while we're gone. We can also control whether the partner character attacks or stays passive. They can defend themselves while we're gone or in combat, but if they don't have much health or ammo, they might just die and we still get a game over. In the original concept for the game, the team toyed with actually allowing one character to die, the game still being able to be completed as long as Rebecca or Billy made it to the end. They eventually had to scrap this idea, obviously, because Rebecca was canonically alive in the next game. The issue with this system isn't really an issue with the system itself, but is a problem that comes from an offshoot of another system. That system is item boxes. Resident Evil 0 removes item boxes entirely. In previous games, characters had limited inventory space, and we had to use item boxes to store items that we didn't need right now. Extra ammunition, extra healing items, key items that we are collecting for a puzzle we haven't reached yet. These item boxes were transferable, meaning that we could put items in an item box on one side of the environment and then grab them from another item box on the other side of an environment. And this was clearly a genius system. We had a limited personal storage, but we had an unlimited storage in specific rooms across the map. This design was also genius because it allows the developer to choose where the player gets access to these item boxes. Maybe they've sent them on a long run, and an item box could offer a reprieve from the onslaught of enemies they've had to move through. Choosing to give that item box to the player a few rooms down the line is an intentional choice that affects how difficult, challenging, or intense a particular stretch of the game is. Placement of item boxes around a larger circular environment also determines where safety lies. And if you've played Resident Evil games before, you can probably remember right now where the item boxes are. The item boxes are touchstones of safety, and those touchstones stick in your mind. Resident Evil 0 does away with this system entirely. We no longer have item boxes in the game. If we want to store items outside of our person, then we need to leave them in areas. We can do this by entering our inventory and selecting the Leave option when highlighting an item. This will make the item disappear from our inventory and appear on the ground in the room that we're currently in. This effectively means that every single room in the game is an item box. We can leave items anywhere and pick them up at any time, provided we have enough inventory space for them. Now, I can totally see why the developers of Resident Evil 0 thought this would be a good idea. If you're trying to revolutionize Resident Evil, what do? You remove the item boxes. You take something central to the series away from the player. Resident Evil has always catered to a survival horror fan base, arguably popularizing the genre in the first place. Taking away the item boxes is just another way to increase intensity. Removing the touchstone of safety, the places that you distinctly remember, only leaves you with the typewriters laid out for saving your progress. These become the only representation of safety in the game, but the lack of safety isn't what makes these item boxes bad. Increasing the intensity doesn't make them ineffective either. It's the way that this balance is integrated into the game and the effects that come from getting rid of the item box that truly tears this entry down. Because we have no item box, and because items are not transported to the next area that we travel to, if we have too many items, we have to leave them on the ground. If we encounter a key item and we don't have room for it, that means we have to leave something in this room, or we have to run back to a place that we'd like to keep the item we're about to drop it, and then run back to grab the key item. This is an incredibly tedious process, and we encounter many problems if we have to leave particularly useful items behind. Let's say that we need to pick up a key item and we decide to leave a first aid spray behind. Later in the game, when we're really in need of a healing item, we'll need to travel back to that room to grab the first aid spray. But maybe it's not in a great location, maybe it's out of our way, or maybe we don't even remember where we left it. Certain items will actually appear on the map when we drop them, but it seems like this only happens if we had them in our inventory first. If we passed an item and decided to leave it for later, we just have to remember that it's there. This is why I tend to call the game's design messy, because the result is an unorganized game layout where items end up scattered around a mansion and we're unable to properly take stock of what we have. In my video on Resident Evil 1, I talked about the resource management in that game. I talked specifically about how Resident Evil could even be referred to as a management simulator because you are effectively gathering resources and then trading those resources for other resources. Trading ammunition by killing an enemy for safety, trading health for security, sometimes trading health or ammunition for more health or ammunition. The game is all about making good trades. This whole dynamic relies on you actually being able to take stock of what you have. Fear and tension in the Resident Evil series are generated from the restriction in resources. We know we lack resources, therefore we're terrified. If we don't know what we do and don't have, because it's spread all throughout the areas of the game, left wantonly by us to pick up more important items at the time, then we truly don't know what we have. This creates an adverse response within the player. They no longer know if this is their last box of ammunition or not. They no longer are aware of whether this is their last healing item. They could have left something out there and just forgotten about it. Who knows? This removes the impact from the actual last box of ammunition because you aren't sure whether you're supposed to place that weight on it or not. This, of course, is only one way of dealing with this system. The other way we could deal with things is to collect all of the items we come across and transfer them to a specific room, probably beside a typewriter. We could collect all these items and leave them there so that we can always take stock of what we have. This creates a bad time for the player, though, for two reasons. For one, it's a tedious process that the player doesn't really want to engage with in the first place, and requires far more backtracking than any of the other games had. The second reason is that this is effectively creating our own item box because the game won't allow us to have one, except that the item box doesn't travel with us to new areas of the game. Not all Resident Evil games need an item box, but Resident Evil 0 was balanced and designed to have one, or it at least feels like it needs one. You would think that having 2 characters and 12 total inventory slots would offset this, but it really doesn't. There are so many items in the game that we need to carry, especially because both characters start off with a pistol and generally at least need 2 slots taken up to carry that weapon and some ammo. We'll also get more weapons later in the game, healing items, and specific key items that need to be carried. The concept of removing the item box is interesting but flawed, sure, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't work. You could do it effectively, but Resident Evil 0 just does not accurately balance itself to deal with this change in mechanics. And it creates a tedious relationship with the game. To be in a better position, you have to act as a pack mule and walk back and forth around the environment. This was sort of present in previous games. If you didn't have enough space for an item, then you could just run back for it later, or come back and grab it after you've gotten some more space. It genuinely feels like the opposite of introducing quality of life changes in a video game. It makes the item box seem like it was introduced later as a way to make things easier for the player, and that this was the prototype. But it wasn't. The item box was removed, and it feels messy without it. There are some other problems that come from the removal of the item box system, but we'll get to those later in the video because they are situational. For now, we take Billy and Rebecca up onto the top of the train. They reconnect some wires to get the automatic doors running, and one of the characters, either Billy or Rebecca, depending on who we had reconnect these wires, gets trapped in a room downstairs in the train. One piece of praise that I will give the 2-character swapping system is that it makes the game truly dynamic. Choosing different characters to do different things does actually yield cutscenes that switch the character based on their current makeup. It could have been easy to just railroad the player into one case, like having Billy be the one that gets stuck in here and just keeping that fixed, but the system stays pretty dynamic, which allows the player a lot of agency for how they'd like to approach the game. You always really want to keep putting Billy into the combat situations though, because he does more damage and doesn't get hurt as much. Since Billy is stuck in this room, we have to have him send a key downstairs using the dumbwaiter. Rebecca can grab this key and make her way further through the train. She gets a briefcase, which, when we find 2 metal rings to open its lock, will yield us a blue keycard that allows us to get to the front of the train. Before that happens, though, we can find a hunting rifle, essentially a double-barrel shotgun, and we have our first boss battle. Another criticism that I have for Resident Evil 0 is that its boss battles are mostly bad. This boss battle in particular sees us fighting off a scorpion in this small, cramped bar car of the train. The scorpion can really only move forward, and our shots push it back. Because of the environment and the enemy that we're fighting, this fight is really just stand and shoot down until the stinger is killed. We can grab an ice pick near here and send it back up to Billy so that he can get out of that locked room. The two can head to the back of the train and grab the hook shot, an item that will plague the rest of this playthrough and make up the bulk of the whining and complaining that I'll do later. This hook shot will allow us to access specific areas that we wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. We need to use it in the train to get back to the roof and drop down into a room that's had its roof destroyed. This allows us to get the blue key card and make our way to the back of the train, where we see 2 Umbrella soldiers who are a part of Delta Team, not to be confused with Bravo or Alpha Team. These guys definitely aren't stars. They're reporting directly to Albert Wesker and William Birkin, who are both monitoring the situation from afar. They're talking about the T-virus leak and how it spread to both this train and the Arclay mansion. Wesker gives Birkin the orders to destroy the train, but the soldiers are killed by leeches before they can do anything. When we enter the front car of the train, Billy and Rebecca determine that they need to stop this thing at any cost, so we need to activate the brakes. The only way that we can do this is to activate them at the front of the train and the back at the same time. We need to leave one character at the front and take the other character all the way through the train to the back, and we only have 3 minutes and 30 seconds to do so. It's actually not that bad, though we do need to contend with just about every enemy that we encounter because the narrow hallways are too small to be able to avoid any enemies that we come across here. This is another negative that this game has, just in general. Avoiding enemies is almost impossible in just about every situation. There are very few circumstances where we even can avoid enemies, and even fewer where it's appropriate. This is something that I really don't like because it feels like we mostly only have one option to engage. This removes player agency and basically takes away the option to run, which previously was used to generate more fear and tension from the player. The duo of fight or flight has been broken apart and only fight remains. On the way to the back of the train, Rebecca encounters the undead Edward, the man we saw die at the beginning of the game. This is really treated as a deeply emotional moment, but it's really only emotional for Rebecca because we have no clue who Edward is.
Edward! No!
It's implied emotion rather than real emotion because we have no experience of him whatsoever. When we get to the back, we complete a pretty simple puzzle to activate the brakes. We have to press 10 buttons total, the sums of which have to add up to the number on screen. When this is done, our partner character, the one we left behind, has to do the same at the front of the train, but their display is busted, so we have to do the math in our head. All of this must be done before the timer runs out, but the rush back to the caboose really isn't that difficult. There's more than enough time here to be comfortable, though the ticking clock is always something that generates more intensity. When both sets of brakes are activated, the train ends up derailing and crashing as it reaches its destination, an Umbrella training facility where the rest of the game will take place. Billy and Rebecca are unscathed in the fiery aftermath, and luckily all of our items that we dropped in the train managed to fly out and hit the ground in front of us. Somehow, this is the only time in the entire game that it actually gives us this grace though, because from here on out, if we need an item, we have to take it with us. Once Billy and Rebecca get inside, they realize they're in an Umbrella research facility. They see a portrait of the first manager of the facility, Dr. James Marcus. Wesker and Birkin are still watching over them, viewing their progress through CCTV footage. We hear Marcus talking over the loudspeaker, giving the Umbrella Corporation's company motto. Birkin and Wesker's monitors are taken over as we see the long-haired man from outside the train admitting that he was the one that scattered the T-virus around both the mansion and the train. This mystery man claims that his motivation is to get revenge on Umbrella as a whole. Dr. Marcus, who this man claims was murdered by Umbrella 10 years ago, appears behind him. It seems to be a strange, reformed creation from the leeches that we saw before, the same man on the train who also formed out of leeches. We then jump back to the training facility, which very much looks like a mansion rather than any sort of facility, but we'll go with it. This is our main area for most of the rest of the game. We'll shift to another area at a later part of the game, but it's connected to this one, so it basically feels like one large building. Besides that, we'll spend a large chunk of time here in this facility. That being said, I honestly think that the train is probably the game's best area, and that it's entirely behind us now. The wreckage of the game's strongest parts is sitting in flames at the entrance to this facility. The train really was a unique approach to the Resident Evil formula, a moving vehicle that we're perched on, and the ways that the team found to still make this vehicle feel like a labyrinth, integrating key items like keycards and briefcases, felt truly awesome. I particularly enjoyed the segments where we had to walk across the roof of the train as the forest was speeding across our vision, rushing past us with rain falling all around. It's a beautiful scene, and the train's aesthetics tend to match this high bar. The narrow cab cars and small rooms are pleasing from a design perspective, but they're functionally cumbersome. Despite that fact, the train is very well organized. It's small, but it wrings every piece of this environment out and gets the juice from it, harvesting down to the last drop. I can't say the same thing about the training facility. The curtain often feels like it's been pulled back, and a lot of the progression here feels meaningless and essential, like busy work. Of course, it's all in the interest of survival, of escape, but it almost doesn't feel like there's a clear goal in mind until the later half of the game. There's, of course, gameplay goals, but an overarching story goal just doesn't feel as present. Our general goal for the training facility is to get 3 tablets, each of which contain one of the 3 Umbrella Company core tenets: obedience, discipline, and unity. Before we can do this, though, we have to make our way through the labyrinth that is the training facility, unlocking various areas of the place and exerting our presence over this environment. We can do this by working our 2 characters like a team. Rebecca has to head to an upper floor of the facility and solve a puzzle involving a giant clock. Umbrella had a specific code for this clock, the time 8:15. Grabbing a facility key with Rebecca and Billy once again working together seems to disturb a massive giant centipede that uses the facility as its home. This is our second boss battle of the game, and we must contend with this monster as it holds Rebecca in its clutches. We basically just pump it full of bullets, and if those run out, we can actually defeat it with a knife. Most of the bosses in the game don't really pose much of a challenge outside of maybe the final one. After defeating it, we can retrieve a key that will allow us to access new areas of the facility. In some of these new areas, we can find small pieces of statues, like the body of a white statue and its wings that are found hidden in a book. These 2 statues, a white one and a black one, must be completed and placed on 2 scales. This will allow us access to an underground part of the facility that we need to get to before we can actually get the tablets that we need to progress. While we move through the facility and find these parts, we can read a note from the assistant director that talks about Albert Wesker and William Birkin. At this point, they were new trainees brought to the facility, and the assistant director planned to use their competitive nature against them. By pitting them against each other, he thought he could make them better than they would be alone. We can also find a diary from the director of the facility, James Marcus, who talks about finding the original progenitor virus. This is the blueprint that was used to create the T-virus. He was working with Spencer to develop this, but Spencer was more interested in developing the business around the virus rather than the actual research itself. This obviously created a rift between the two of them, but Marcus had combined the progenitor virus with the DNA of leeches to create the T-virus, and planned to use this creation to gain the upper hand. Spencer eventually interfered with his research and started to send people to steal the work, or at least that was Marcus's suspicion. Gaining both statues and completing them will slide open the painting of James Marcus, revealing an underground passage to the facility behind it. Spiders abound downstairs, filling the hallways and threatening us with their poison spit. In a nearby room, we can boost Rebecca up into a vent, and she ends up in a torture chamber filled with gore and viscera. We can tinker with the power box here, which allows the door to this enclosed room to unlock, but we quickly see the mystery man watching Rebecca in this room. At this point, he unleashes the hounds upon us, or rather the monkeys, a new enemy type that we'll contend with in Resident Evil 0. Rebecca is immediately attacked and the floor crumbles beneath her. We see Wesker and Birkin once again. They seem to think they know who the mystery man is, but they don't tell us quite yet. Wesker plans to leave. It's time for him to lure the members of STARS into the Arclay mansion. He wants to get the combat data from the BOWs, and Birkin plans to stick around and self-destruct the facility to cover it all up. It seems like a bad place for this cutscene to occur, because Rebecca is still dangling by a thread in the other room. As Billy, we have to rescue her and make a mad dash through the facility to get her location as quickly as we can. On the way, we must contend with the newly released undead monkeys. This is probably the first of Resident Evil 0's enemies that are incredibly annoying. The game in general has pretty bad enemy design. The monkeys are very strong and they're super quick. It's almost impossible to approach them with a strategy in any way. They're almost like zombie dogs in that they jump and run at us, but it's much harder to interrupt their jump animation. The plague crawlers, which are like mutated cockroaches or some form of insect, are also difficult to contend with. You can easily lock them in an animation by shooting them as long as you're standing just off to the side of their body, but this is almost impossible in most areas of the game because the areas that you contend with them in are generally so small and narrow. There's an even more annoying enemy that we'll fight soon, but before we get to that, we rescue Rebecca from falling down an endless pit. After we save her, Rebecca gets another radio call from Enrico. He's somehow still concerned about locating Billy in all this. Like, there's a pretty bad zombie outbreak. Not sure that locating the prisoner should be the biggest of your worries right now. You should probably be concerned about the newly created zombie monkeys that are about to be set loose upon the world. Just my 2 cents. Rebecca doesn't tell him that she's with Billy, and this act of kindness touches him. Rebecca decides to ask him what really happened, if he is actually, a huge mass murderer or not. We see a flashback to Billy's time in the armed forces. His team was searching for some guerrilla forces in the jungle. They were ambushed in the woods, and only 4 people survived. When they found the group, they realized that they were given false information, and they were ordered to attack a village of innocent civilians. His captain did this, but Billy seems to have stopped him and been blamed for the murders. Rebecca wants to know if he actually killed those people, but Billy just responds and says, "Hey, can't judge me, you promised."
Forget about it. Doesn't matter anymore. That was then, this is now. Besides, You said you wouldn't judge me.
Rebecca realizes that the zombies attacked the van in the woods, and Billy wasn't actually guilty of that either. But Billy will either be killed at the hands of his superiors or sentenced to a life of running from them forever. With the group back together again, we can finally gather the 3 tablets that we need to progress to the next area. While searching for them in the underground, we can find a note written by someone who was succumbing to the virus. A note that's ending might actually rival the famous Itchy Tasty. Dennis gone, I go, hungry. Downstairs, we can find the Unity tablet. We can find another outside of the front entrance, and the final one in a deep passage of rooms off to the side of the building. This part of the building is where we're introduced to the most annoying enemy in the game by far, the leech monsters. These are similar to the first enemy that we fought in the train. They kind of have extending limbs like the Bandersnatch from Code Veronica, except that we have to kill them in a very specific way. If we kill them with fire, Molotovs, or grenades, then they'll just fizzle out and die. If we kill them with regular weapons, then the top half of their body is destroyed and they swell up and explode, dealing massive damage to us. This isn't a problem in theory, like most of the issues with Resident Evil 0. It is a well-intentioned addition. Having to mechanically work around being damaged by an enemy is fine, but if resources are scarce, then you can't work around this. You have to eat the damage, try to avoid it, or trick the game by leaving the hallway before the enemy explodes, so that it still thinks the enemy is dead. It's just a very annoying type of enemy to fight. In contrast to other enemies from the series, we don't have to think our way around it, we just either have enough resources to contend with it, or we don't. Once we gain all 3 tablets, we can place these in the observatory. This actually prompts us to switch to disc 2 of the game, and we immediately see a giant phallic object shrinking into the ocean. Inserting the tablets into the panel has moved the observatory, and now allows us to access the laboratory across the bridge. Heading over here, we can enter a church with 1 character, and we are immediately attacked by a giant bat boss. Now, I know a lot of people had trouble with this boss, and do consider it one of the worst enemies in this entry, but I didn't really experience that. The main issue is that the giant bat summons other smaller bats, and the auto-aim in Resident Evil 0 will lock onto those instead of the boss you're trying to shoot at. You can pretty easily get around this though if you just wait for him to fly at you before aiming. I fought this thing with both the shotgun and the grenade launcher, and didn't really have an issue. Once this church is cleared out, we can continue forward. But what's that? We need to do so by getting into that massive hole in the ceiling? Well, the only way we could do that is with the hook shot. That's right. Remember that item that we used literally once, all the way back on the train? Yeah, we have to use it again, and we have to use it a lot in this section of the game. This is where Resident Evil 0's item management system rears its ugly head once again. First of all, if you didn't know that you were going to have to use the hook shot again, then you probably just left it all the way back at the place where the train crashed, which means that you're going to have to run all the way back into the training facility and go grab it, which is annoying, but it isn't detrimental. The other problems with changing areas in this game is that we're about to be heading through an elevator and going to an underground lab. But since there's no train crash here, the game doesn't automatically transport our items from the training facility to this new area. This means we're also going to have to run back with free inventory spaces and transport everything to the next area like pack mules. This is, once again, a huge downside to not having item boxes. You would also think that because we can just leave items on the ground, that it wouldn't be a big deal, that we just transport everything. But it still is, because there's a limit that each area has on how many items we can leave there. I'm not sure if this is because of a technical limitation that the systems at the time had, or if it's just because the team didn't want the areas getting so cluttered that you couldn't pick stuff up. But it's there. This further scatters items and truly prevents you from creating your own item boxes. But not to mention the fact that breaking up this section of the game by forcing the player to run back and grab all the stuff that they left in the previous hub area is just general bad game design. The player has the option to just leave it all there, but at this point, each character has handguns. We have a shotgun and a grenade launcher that we need to take with us, as well as the hook shot, which we'll need underground so that we can progress forward. That's 8 of our 12 total inventory spots taken up just by weapons or key items that we need. That's not to mention the key items that we'll pick up in the upcoming area, healing items, and ammo for those weapons. This creates a no-win scenario for the player, where they either leave behind valuable items under the fear of the tedium that awaits them, or they struggle through the boredom of backtracking and managing their inventory for the next half hour. Regardless of which poison we pick, we can head down into the elevator underneath the church. Inside of a library, Rebecca and Billy will be separated once again, as one of them will have to head upstairs with the hookshot. There's another sort of dumbwaiter here that we can use to pass items back to Rebecca downstairs. We eventually have to do this with a sample of the leech DNA so that Rebecca can create a key that will allow her access to a room downstairs. Rebecca eventually finds a photo of James Marcus and determines that the mystery man must be his son or grandson. The two make their way through the facility and eventually get access to a cable car that they determine must be their way out. Once we get this thing running though, Billy is attacked and he falls over the railing. We're now separated once again and Rebecca will have to head down the cable car alone to rescue him. Taking the cable car down, we actually find ourselves in a facility that looks eerily similar to the one that we enter in Resident Evil 2. You can even see the same turntable layout and the narrow passageway where we are attacked by Mr. X. I believe it actually is the same facility. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I guess it doesn't really much make sense since there's already an outbreak here before Resident Evil 2. But I guess that's what happens when you try to make prequels. As Rebecca tries to enter the facility, she finally meets up with Enrico. He tries to get Rebecca to come with him so they can head to an old research mansion that Umbrella uses. Rebecca tells him that she's going to go find Billy, and Enrico tells her to be careful before heading off.
That's unfortunate. If we go straight from here, we should arrive at an old mansion which Umbrella uses for research. Come on, let's go.
Wait! I've got to find Billy.
Billy Cohen? You mean you found that criminal?
Yes, but we got separated and...
No point worrying about him. He won't make it. Come on, let's go.
Sir, please. I need to find him. Don't worry, I'll catch up with you.
Rebecca... All right. Just be careful.
I never saw him again.
On the other side of this elevator, we are attacked by a tyrant, our next boss of this entry. He's really not that difficult and pretty similar to the tyrant that we would fight in Resident Evil 1. He mostly does large slashing attacks, but since we were just given a magnum pistol before this fight, we can easily take him down with that. On the way down the elevator, we see the mystery man watching Rebecca once again, leeches crawling across his screen. He doesn't say much other than a declaration that he will get his revenge no matter what. Pretty shortly after taking the elevator downstairs, Rebecca sees Billy being washed away by the torrent. We have to save him by solving a puzzle that restores power to the dam. This will thankfully stop the water and prevent Billy from being dashed against the rocks. The two quickly find a ton of disposed bodies down here, test subjects for Marcus's research. At this point, the end game is in clear view, and our only goal is really to escape this place by any means necessary. We move through the facility dealing with hunters and a variety of different virus-created monsters. We eventually contend with the tyrant once again, which is a little more difficult since it's in a pretty enclosed space, but there's no new mechanics introduced here. The two characters eventually get a keycard and manage to enter the final area of the game. We face off with the mystery man from before, who reveals that he was actually Dr. Marcus this whole time. He says that 10 years prior, Spencer had him killed for his research. Birkin and Wesker were the ones that did it, his own pupils. Since he was thrown into the water, one of his experimental leeches crawled into his system and created the beast that he has become. He wants to destroy Umbrella and enact his revenge upon the world. Marcus begins vomiting leeches and transforms into a grotesque creation before our eyes. The actual transformation of Marcus is actually insanely cool, but I'm really not a big fan of the resulting monster, especially when you compare it to the other bosses from the Resident Evil series. We blast him full of holes and we have one final door to open. Using 2 keys that have to be turned at the same time, Rebecca and Billy try to make their way out of this place. As they're taking the elevator to the surface, the Queen Leech monster begins crawling up the elevator shaft. We have to defeat this huge beast, but it's not possible with even the best firepower. Eventually, Rebecca realizes that the monster is sensitive to sunlight, so we need to distract the thing while she tries to open the shutters around the room. This is actually a really cool fight, especially for so early in the series. It reminds me of activating the rail cannon in Resident Evil 3, except that we're not actually doing it. I kind of wish it put us in Rebecca's shoes for this fight instead of Billy, but it's fine. We basically just shoot at the Queen over and over and try to take its attention away from Rebecca while she activates the handles around the facility. Once she does this, the light weakens the Queen, and Rebecca tosses Billy a revolver that she finds behind a crate. Billy gets to deliver his epic action one-liner.
Hey, Queenie! Feast on this!
I can't say that this sequence made the entire game worth it, because it definitely didn't, but it's a pretty cool way to end such a lackluster title. I also just have to praise the CG cutscenes for this game, because while Resident Evil was always very ahead of its time, this game just looks spectacular in most every place. There's so much detail here. With the exploding facility, you can see all the pieces of wood flying away, and even in the earlier cutscenes before our fight with the Stinger in the train, you can see the shards of glass as the chandelier falls. After this cutscene, we see Rebecca and Billy standing atop a cliff. Billy finally frees himself of his cuffs, and Rebecca sees the Arclay mansion off in the distance. She rips Billy's dog tags off, taking them away so that she can give the official story that he died in these woods, and so he can live a life free of the crimes that he was wrongfully accused of. The two stand at attention before Rebecca leaves, and Billy whispers a quiet thank you under his breath. We see a foreboding shot of the mansion below as the events of Resident Evil are about to kick off. That marks the end of Resident Evil 0, and I can't say that I don't enjoy its final moments. The last action sequence, this great shot of Billy and Rebecca standing on the cliff with the sun blasting behind them. It's all pretty good, but the rest of the game just really doesn't live up to that, and the ending does not justify the means. First of all, this story kind of feels like a step back compared to what we got in the last game, Code Veronica. The two games have quite a bit in common when it comes to narrative. That game also tried to focus on the origin of the T-Virus and the origins of Umbrella as a whole. It feels like both games are sort of dueling for a canon interpretation of the beginning of this series. While Code Veronica focuses on the origins of the family that created the company, Zero focuses on the origins of the man that created the virus. But in my opinion, Code Veronica just does this concept better. It has better characters that develop an interesting world around this series. That's something that Resident Evil 0 quite lacks. A prequel, in my mind, should explain the foundation of this story. What does the world around the stories that we've already seen look like? Where did this all start? How did it begin? And Code Veronica excels at that, making Resident Evil feel like it has an actual world, a true origin story. Resident Evil 0 doesn't really do this. We're basically introduced to James Marcus during this game, a character that, I'll give it to them, has a little bit of depth. It was interesting to learn that he was manipulating Wesker and Birkin against each other, weaponizing their competitive nature to further his own research. This details a portrait of a man that will do anything to get further in his goals. But this concept is barely fleshed out throughout the runtime of the story. We just have Marcus, whose identity is unknown throughout the entirety of the game, and in the last 20 minutes or so, we're told, actually, this is Marcus, and he's pissed because he wants revenge. Ooh. And then we kill him, and that's it. This reveal probably should have come a lot sooner in the game so that we had time to understand who the villain actually was. Not to mention the fact that Wesker and Birkin are just sort of footnotes in this game. It feels like they were just included purely for reference purposes, so that fans of the series could go, hey, look, it's those guys. They're really just on the outside of the conflict the entire time, constantly watching from behind screens, from afar, but never really interfering outside of just setting the self-destruct to go off. There's really nothing added to their characters either, aside from the notes that tell us about their training. But honestly, their characters were developed more in the 2 Wesker reports than anything in Resident Evil 0. And the game just has an overall lack of story. Of course, this isn't anything new to the series. The first 3 games in the series aren't overflowing with narrative. That was really only introduced once we got to Code Veronica. But Resident Evil 0 returns to this less is more storytelling method, but does it far worse than any of those games did. We of course have the 2 main characters to talk about as well, Rebecca and Billy. Billy is an interesting enough character, and Resident Evil successfully subverts our expectations by revealing halfway through that Billy is not actually a cold-blooded killer, but a man who was wrongfully accused. This, of course, makes us empathetic towards his plight and plants the player on his side firmly. Outside of the alleged murders, though, he's not really that interesting. Most of the time that he is on screen speaking is just him talking about those events. He really only has that and nothing else to his personality. I do like his character design just in general. The handcuffs hanging off his wrist the entire game, and this sick-ass early 2000s tattoo on his shoulder. Rebecca, on the other hand, already has an appearance in 1 full game that gives her some background. And if you've seen my video on the first Resident Evil game, you'll know that Rebecca Chambers was my favorite character in that entry.
Yeah, that's my bitch.
Still is. So I was actually pretty excited to play this game because I wanted to see more of what they did with that character. And I'm sad to say that it actually made me realize that Rebecca works better as a side character. Her appeal in the first game came from the fact that she was a plucky, sort of upbeat beacon of light in this dark tale. And while that isn't even overtly present here, she's just sort of a blank slate for the player to replace themselves with. That whole character just worked better when it was trying to help the character that we were actually playing. Part of that outlook came from the fact that in Resident Evil 1, Rebecca was the youngest member of STARS, and that she had never experienced anything even close to this. The remake introduced scenes that tried to show how she actually dealt with things. So making a whole game that shows, actually, Rebecca has already dealt with, arguably, a worse version of the things that she's going through in the first Resident Evil game just doesn't really make sense. Of course, this is more retcon nitpicking, but it begs the question, was this game really even necessary? Well, I honestly think that the game would have worked better when it was first announced. When they originally started development, we hadn't moved so far past the original Raccoon City trilogy, but at this point, why do we really need to know what Rebecca was up to the day before Resident Evil? Also, why do we need to know that what she was up to was going through a Resident Evil level journey through an entirely different facility before she even met Chris in the mansion? It almost feels like it cheapens the story of Resident Evil 1 just a little bit. As a whole, I obviously have a lot of issues with Resident Evil 0. Its systems are what I would consider better on paper than they were in reality. Getting rid of the item box is certainly a way to set yourself apart and try to disrupt the formula of the games that came before, but it flat out just doesn't work. It makes the game much more tedious than it needs to be. Not only that, but it makes a game in a series that is known for being quite clean turn out really messy and disorganized. And not every game has to be organized. There are some projects that just thrive in the chaos, but it just doesn't really work here. The two-character system that was introduced is technically impressive, but doesn't ever really feel like it gets to hit its stride in this entry. Maybe if they gave it another go at a later point, they could have done more interesting things with it. But for most of the game, we're honestly just using both characters anyway, the less powerful one being dragged along behind us like it's a really long escort mission. This whole game just really feels chaotic, like it's got a good skin of a Resident Evil game, but it just doesn't know what's supposed to go inside. The organs are in the wrong places, the heart is where the brain should be, and the intestines are twisted up in knots. I say this to mean that Resident Evil 0 looks fine from the outside, but once you get your hands on it, you realize something is very wrong. On release, critics generally gave positive reviews to Resident Evil 0, though most still pointed out the issues with the new changes that the project made. In terms of gameplay, they did praise its graphics and atmosphere, which were marked as a high point. Later reviews, like those for the HD re-release, were less kind and noted how dated the game felt years later. The original game currently has an 83 out of 100 on Metacritic. The game sold well though, shipping 1.25 million copies for the GameCube version, showing that fans would still be there to purchase any new Resident Evil games. But 1.25 million was a small number compared to what the next entry in the series would bring in. That game would change the series forever, still being lauded as one of the best games of all time to this day. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad. Thank you for watching this video. I've really been enjoying going through the Resident Evil series like this. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, as it really helps me out. You can even subscribe to the channel so you won't miss another video. I'm also currently watching all of the Resident Evil movies over on my Patreon and reviewing them when I'm done. So go check that out because it's been a great time. And while they aren't the best movies in the world, some of them have been really fun. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.